The Amarillo sun scorched the Texas plains with merciless intensity as dust devils rose and fell across the landscape like the breath of some great sleeping beast. The Garrison estate sprawled across 10,000 acres, a monument to blood money and exploitation. The main house was a grotesque display of wealth, white columns, manicured lawns that required constant irrigation in this unforgiving climate, and windows that gleamed like the eyes of a predator. Behind the grand facade lay the true machinery of the operation, holding pens, auction blocks, and ledgers filled with human names reduced to inventory numbers. Eleanor Garrison stood in her father's study, her fingers trembling as she gripped the manifest she'd stolen from his desk. 23 women were listed on tomorrow's auction, their names, ages, physical descriptions, and estimated market values all neatly catalogued in her father's precise handwriting. 41. That was her father's age, and also the number of years Eleanor had lived under the shadow of his cruelty, watching him build his fortune on the suffering of others. She was 25 now, and for the first time in her life, she had decided to stop watching. Eleanor's mother had died when she was 8, killed by a fever that the family's finest doctors couldn't cure with all their money and influence. Her father, Vincent Garrison, had responded to that loss by becoming harder, colder, more ruthless. He'd explained it to her once when she was a child, drunk on expensive brandy. Sentiment is a luxury only the poor can afford. The rich must deal in absolutes. Power, control, profit. She'd believed him then. She'd accepted the logic of his empire, even as she witnessed its horrors. But somewhere in the past year, watching the women who passed through the auction block, seeing the way her father's associates looked at them with hunger and contempt, something inside Eleanor had fractured irreparably. She could no longer pretend that the money in her accounts wasn't soaked in tears. The knock on her door came softly, urgently. Eleanor stuffed the manifest into the bodice of her dress and opened it to find James Coulter standing in the hallway. James was a ranch hand who managed the estate's horses, a position that had given him access to every corner of the property. He'd come to the main house ostensibly to report on the breeding stock, but his eyes told Eleanor he knew what she'd been reading. "We need to go," he whispered, his weathered face grave. "Now, before your father returns from Galveston." Eleanor shook her head, though her heart raced with a mixture of fear and something that might have been hope. "The auction is tomorrow. Those women will be lost whether you run tonight or stay and try to stop it," James said, not unkindly. "But you can still be saved. Come with me." James Coulter was a mystery on the Garrison estate. He'd arrived 3 years ago, quiet and efficient, and had gradually earned Vincent's trust through impeccable work and the kind of invisibility that made him valuable. Eleanor had noticed him first not as an individual, but as a kind presence. He would leave water for the animals in the holding pens, would speak to the captives with something approaching respect. When their eyes had met one evening as she watched from a distance, she'd seen his judgment and his invitation simultaneously. Over the past months, his quiet resistance had awakened something in Eleanor that her father's philosophy had tried to kill, a conscience. "If I leave," Eleanor said slowly, "I can't come back. Everything I am is tied to this estate." "Everything you are." James stepped closer, his voice intense. "Oh, everything you've been told you are. Your father's daughter, the heiress to an empire built on human misery. That's not who you are, Miss Garrison. I've seen glimpses of the real Eleanor, and she's worth far more than all of this." He gestured vaguely at the opulent study, with its mahogany desk and leather-bound books. Eleanor moved to the window and looked out at the estate spread before her, the main house, the servants' quarters, the barns, and beyond them, the holding pens where tomorrow's auction merchandise was currently secured. In her mind's eye, she could see her father striding through those pens, inspecting his human inventory with the same cold assessment he might give to cattle. "If I help you free them," she said quietly, "we'd need a plan. Money, horses, a destination they could actually reach." James was silent for a long moment. "You can't save them all, Eleanor. That's the first thing you need to understand. Some will choose to go back to their communities. Some will try to reach Canada. Some will scatter to cities where they might disappear. You can't control their choices, and you can't carry the weight of saving them. What you can do is give them the chance to save themselves. My father will hunt anyone who helps them escape. I know what he'll do," James interrupted. "I've already accepted that consequence. The question is whether you have." Eleanor turned from the window to face him fully. James Coulter was a handsome man in an understated way, his face weathered by sun, his eyes holding depths that suggested a complicated past, his hands bearing the calluses of honest work. She'd never allowed herself to consider him as anything other than an ally, but standing here in this moment of rebellion, she saw him clearly, a man of genuine principle in a world that had taught her principle of weakness. "What do we do?" she asked. They worked through the night, moving with the precision of people who understood that discovery meant death. James had 3 horses hidden in a canyon 2 miles from the estate. Eleanor wrote a letter to her father, not asking for forgiveness but refusing to beg it. She included the manifest of tomorrow's auction, names, descriptions, everything. Let him know that she'd seen, that she'd understood, that she had chosen differently. At 2 a.m., James disabled the locks on the holding pens. Eleanor provided the key to the tack room where wort and provisions had been assembled. She offered each woman a choice: follow James to safety, or remain. To her heartbreak and frustration, some chose to stay, paralyzed by fear or convinced that escape would only bring worse consequences. But 17 women chose freedom. James led them through the darkness toward the canyon, using paths only he knew. Eleanor followed last, carrying the bag that held the money she'd withdrawn from her personal account. $30,000, a fortune that felt pitifully small when weighed against human lives. The canyon was hidden behind rock formations that rose like the bones of giants. Once the women were safely concealed, James turned to Eleanor, and she saw raw emotion cross his face for the first time. "You can't stay with us," he said. "You'd put them at greater risk. Your father will look for you, and your association with them will create a trail he could follow." Eleanor had prepared herself for this moment, though the pain of it was sharper than she'd anticipated. "Where will they go?" "There's a community of freed women in Colorado, near Denver. An old friend of mine runs a boarding house where they can find work and rebuild their lives. It's not perfect, but it's better than anything here." He paused. "I'm going to take them there. But you need to disappear completely. I have a contact in San Francisco, a man who can set you up with new documentation, a new identity. It'll cost most of your money, but you'll be able to start over." "Come with me," Eleanor said suddenly. "To San Francisco. You could." "No," James said, and his voice held a finality that didn't allow for argument. "These women are my responsibility now. And your father, he'll never stop looking for you if we're together. He'd use that connection to find you. But alone, with a new name, you disappear into the city. You live Eleanor. That's what matters." She wanted to argue, to insist that they could face whatever came together. But Eleanor had spent 25 years watching practical cruelty, and she recognized it now in a different form, the harsh mercy of sacrifice. "Promise me something," she said. "Promise that you'll tell those women the truth. That I helped them escape not out of nobility, but out of shame. Out of finally understanding that I'd been complicit in evil because I was too comfortable to resist it." James reached out and took her hand. His grip was warm and strong, anchoring her to the real world when she felt like she might dissolve into tears. "I promise," he said, "and I'll tell them your name, the real one, so that when they build their new lives, they'll remember that it took someone willing to burn everything down to give them a chance." They rode together to a way station 40 miles north, where James's contact waited with fresh horses and supplies. The journey was tense and silent, filled with the weight of everything that couldn't be said. At dawn, Eleanor watched as James turned his horse back toward the canyon where the women waited. "James," she called out as he prepared to ride away, "will I ever see you again?" He looked at her across the distance that had already begun to stretch between them, and his expression held both sorrow and something like peace. "In another life," he said, "in a world where your father never existed, where this estate was never built on suffering, in that world, Eleanor, we would have had a beautiful story together. But in this world, the most beautiful thing we can do is let each other go so that we can both be free." 6 months later, Eleanor Garrison ceased to exist. In her place was Catherine Wells, a quiet woman who worked in a bookstore in San Francisco, lived in a modest apartment, and donated money anonymously to organizations that help women rebuild their lives after trauma. She allowed herself to think of James only in the darkest hours of night, and she never permitted herself to wonder if he thought of her. A year later, a newspaper arrived at a bookstore with a story about a mysterious theft from a Garrison estate. 17 women freed, the holding pens destroyed, and the manifest and names distributed to authorities across multiple states. The article reported that Vincent Garrison had hired trackers to hunt the escapees, but they had vanished into the network of safe houses and communities that existed in the shadowy spaces beyond his reach. The article mentioned a cowboy with no name, glimpsed helping women across the border into Colorado. It mentioned reward posters that never caught their prey. Eleanor folded the newspaper carefully and placed it under her mattress. That night, she wept, not for herself, but for the man who had taught her what honor looked like and who had loved her enough to let her live a life beyond his shadow. Years would pass, and Catherine Wells would build a modest but honest life. She would help women find shelter and employment. She would open a small school where she taught reading to those denied that basic right. She would never marry, though she would be loved by several good men who sensed the tragic depth in her eyes and couldn't quite reach it. On quiet evenings, she would sometimes stand at her window and look toward the east, toward the vast landscape of the American frontier, and remember a man who had shown her that redemption wasn't about erasing your past. It was about choosing a better future, even when that choice meant standing alone. And somewhere in Colorado, in a small town whose name never made it into history books, James Coulter continued his quiet work, helping the broken rebuild their lives, forever carrying the weight of the woman he'd loved enough to release.